Careful, Theodore. Someone might steal her while you're busy building empires. Evelyn Harper teased, her voice sharp with mischief as Layla and Kosi twirled across the dance floor in the arms of a charming developer, leaving billionaire Theodore Bennett frozen with jealousy. Welcome to A Love Beyond the Office, a tale of unspoken love and bold risks. Where are you tuning in from, and what do you think happens when a tycoon finally faces his heart? Will Theodore confess his love, or will Layla slip away? Subscribe to our channel to catch every twist of this captivating story and share your location in the comments to join our global audience. Can a dance change destiny? Will 5 years of restraint unravel in one night? Dive in with us to find out. The Chicago skyline shimmered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of Pinnacle Hotel's headquarters, a constellation of glass and steel that seemed to pulse with the city's restless ambition. On the 48th floor, in an office where power hung as thick as the scent of polished oak, Layla and Kosi paused outside Theodore Bennett's door. The sharp, rhythmic tap of his Mont Blanc pen against the desk, rapid, impatient, told her everything she needed to know. Theodore, the billionaire who turned his father's modest hotel chain into a regional empire, was on edge. For 5 years, Layla had been his shadow, his anchor, the black woman whose intellect and grace kept his world spinning smoothly. She adjusted her tailored navy blazer, smoothed a stray braid, and knocked twice, the sound crisp against the frosted glass. "Come in," Theodore's voice called, low and distracted. Layla entered, her heels silent on the plush carpet, her tablet glowing with the day's demands. She set his coffee, black, no sugar, precisely 140 degrees, exactly 3 inches from his right hand, a ritual perfected over the years. "Your 2 p.m. with the Miami investors is confirmed," she said, her voice steady, warm, like a note held just long enough to linger. "The Dubai contract revisions are in your inbox, and your sister Clara called about brunch." Theodore's fingers froze over his laptop, his green eyes flicking up to meet hers. "What did she want?" he asked, though he already knew. "The usual," Layla replied, a faint smile curving her lips. "Why did you skip your niece's recital when you're visiting, if you're eating enough greens?" She paused, her tone softening with a hint of amusement. "I told her you had a merger crisis." Theodore leaned back, his chair creaking faintly, and for a moment the room held only the hum of the city below and the weight of their shared silence. Layla stood with perfect posture, her sleek braid framing a face that needed no adornment, her dark eyes sharp with an intelligence that both steadied and unnerved him. He'd built an empire on reading people, guests, investors, rivals, but Layla was a language he'd never fully translated. She knew his habits with uncanny precision, the way he loosened his tie when wrestling a problem, the way he removed his cufflinks when he'd found the solution. She knew he loathed tomatoes, that he preferred his coffee scalding, that he worked late to avoid the emptiness of his penthouse. And yet, what did he know of her? He knew she read poetry on her lunch breaks, her fingers tracing lines of Neruda or Angelo with quiet reverence. He knew she volunteered at a Southside literacy center, her weekends spent teaching kids to love words. He knew her laugh, rare like sunlight breaking through clouds, could shift the energy of a boardroom. He knew she'd turned down 3 job offers from competitors, each more lucrative than the last, though he'd never dared ask why she stayed. "You always know," he murmured, almost to himself, his gaze lingering on the silver pen tucked behind her ear, a small rebellion against her polished professionalism. "It's my job," Layla replied, but her voice carried a warmth that felt like more than duty. She consulted her tablet, her fingers moving with practiced grace. "The Phoenix Group wants to host the next meeting at their site. Something about showing you their vision in person. I said we'd consider it." Theodore's lips twitched, a rare, almost smile. "We?" The words slipped out, unguarded, and Layla's eyebrow arched, a subtle challenge. "You, obviously," she said, her tone dry but her eyes dancing with something unspoken. Theodore cleared his throat, retreating to his screen. "Set it up, but I want you there for the negotiation." "Of course," she said, her voice smooth, professional, yet laced with that quiet acknowledgement of their partnership. a dance of proximity and restraint they'd perfected over half a decade. She moved to the corner table, where his lunch sat untouched, a sandwich she knew he'd ordered out of habit rather than hunger. "Most people eat their food, you know," she said, removing the tomatoes without being asked, her movements efficient yet gentle. "I was busy," he said, his eyes tracking her hands, the way they worked with a grace that made the mundane seem almost sacred. "You're always busy," she countered, placing the sandwich back down. "But nutrition isn't optional, even for hotel tycoons." Theodore watched her, caught by the way she navigated his world with such ease, as if she'd always belonged in it. He knew her favorite coffee shop was the one on Wabash, where she'd linger over a latte on slow mornings. He knew she wore a small silver bracelet, a gift from her mother, that she touched when lost in thought. He knew her presence in his office each morning was the one constant that made the chaos of his empire bearable. But there were gaps, pieces of Layla's life he'd never touched, questions he'd never asked, afraid of what the answers might reveal about the space between them. "Layla," he said, her name heavier on his tongue than usual, a question forming before he could stop it. "Why do you stay?" The words hung in the air, raw and unguarded, like a note struck off key. Layla turned slowly, her professional mask slipping just enough to reveal a flicker of vulnerability. "Because," she began, then paused as if weighing the cost of truth. "Because someone has to make sure you don't live on coffee and ambition alone." The deflection was deft, but Theodore caught the hesitation, the unspoken weight behind it. In the silence that followed, the city hummed 48 floors below, oblivious to the quiet war of trust and restraint unfolding in the corner office. "Your 3 p.m. is here," she said finally, checking her phone, her voice steady again. "The architect from Denver." Theodore nodded, his throat tight. "Send them in." As Layla moved toward the door, he found himself studying the elegant line of her neck, the confident set of her shoulders, the way she commanded respect without ever raising her voice. He'd built his success on understanding what people wanted before they knew it themselves. But Layla remained a beautiful enigma, a woman who knew him better than anyone, yet whose own heart he'd never dared to read. As the door closed behind her, Theodore realized he was holding his breath, and for the first time in years, he wondered what might happen if he let it go. The Chicago drizzle fell in a relentless curtain, blurring the neon glow of Michigan Avenue into a watercolor haze. Theodore Bennett stood motionless on the sidewalk, his charcoal suit darkening with each drop, his broad shoulders hunched as if the weight of the city itself pressed against them. The loss of the Ellison deal, a boutique hotel that once echoed with his grandfather Jonah's footsteps as a doorman in the 1940s, cut deeper than any boardroom defeat. It wasn't just a property, it was a promise, a tether to a legacy he'd sworn to honor. His green eyes, usually sharp with calculation, stared blankly at the rain-slicked street, where headlights carved fleeting paths through the dusk. The world moved around him, indifferent, businessmen with briefcases, tourists clutching maps, a street musician's saxophone wailing faintly in the distance. But Theodore was an island, adrift in his own storm. Lylan and Kosi stepped out of Pinnacle Hotel's glass tower at 7:12 p.m. Later than planned, her tablet still warm from managing Theodore's Tokyo call. The video feed had stuttered, the investors had bristled, but she'd kept the deal on track with quiet efficiency, her notes precise, her calm unshakable. Now pulling her coat tighter against the chill, she spotted him across the street, a solitary figure in the rain, his expensive suit no shield against the elements. Most would have minded their own business, hurrying home to dry warmth. Layla wasn't most. Her heels clicked sharply against the wet pavement as she crossed, dodging a cyclist in a puddle, her compact umbrella snapping open with a defiant pop. She stopped beside him, close enough to see the water beating in his dark hair, and held the umbrella over them both, forcing them into a space barely wide enough for two. "Victory or defeat?" she asked, her voice light but laced with a knowing edge, her dark eyes searching his face. Theodore startled, as if yanked from a dream, his gaze meeting hers with a flicker of surprise. "Defeat," he said, his voice rough, almost lost in the patter of rain. "Horizon Group outbid us on Ellison. Better terms." Layla's expression softened, her lips parting slightly as she processed the weight of his words. She knew what the Ellison meant, Not from boardroom briefings, but from the way Theodore's fingers lingered on the blueprints tucked in his desk drawer. From the stories he'd let slip about Jonah Bennett, the doorman who'd spun tales of the hotel's golden age. "Your grandfather worked there," she said quietly, her voice steady despite the wind tugging at her umbrella. "Jonah, from 1942 to 1959. You wanted to call it the Jonah." Theodore's breath caught, his eyes narrowing as he turned to face her fully. He'd never shared those blueprints, never spoken the name aloud in her presence. "How did you—" he began, his voice trailing off as if afraid to finish the question. Layla's smile was soft, almost conspiratorial, her brown skin catching the faint glow of a nearby street lamp. "I notice things," she said, her tone matter-of-fact but warm, like a secret shared between old friends. "It's what you pay me for." The words were simple, but they landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the space between them. Theodore stared, the rain forgotten, his pulse quickening at the way she saw through him. Not just the CEO, but the man who carried his grandfather's dreams like a quiet ache. The drizzle intensified, drumming against the umbrella, forcing them closer until Layla's jasmine perfume mingled with the crisp, rain-washed air. Theodore felt his chest tighten, caught by the warmth of her presence, the small scar above her left eyebrow. A childhood mishap she'd mentioned once, years ago in a rare unguarded moment. Her breath formed tiny clouds in the cool evening air, and he noticed the way her fingers gripped the umbrella handle, steady but tense, as if she, too, felt the weight of this moment. "You stayed late again," he said, his voice softer now, searching. "You needed me," she replied, her eyes meeting his with a clarity that made him feel exposed, as if she could read the chaos behind his carefully constructed facade. The silence that followed was heavy, alive with the city's pulse, the honk of a distant cab, the splash of tires through puddles, the faint laughter of a couple ducking into a cafe. Theodore's jaw tightened, his mind replaying the Ellison loss. 18 months of planning, negotiations, dreams of restoring the hotel where Jonah had worked, where stories of dreamers and travelers had filled his childhood. "They chose a soulless chain," he said almost to himself, his voice edged with bitterness. "Over what?" Layla asked, tilting her head, her umbrella shielding them like a fragile sanctuary. "Over something that mattered," he said, the words sharper than he intended, raw with a vulnerability he rarely allowed. Layla's gaze held his, unwavering. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that matched his own. "I know what that property meant to you." Theodore's eyes searched hers, startled by her precision, her ability to see the heart of his pain. "Do you?" he asked, the question escaping before he could stop it, a challenge and a plea. "Jonah Bennett," she said, her voice gentle but firm, like she was reciting a truth she'd memorized. "Night doorman at the Ellison. He told you stories about the guests, their dreams, their secrets. You wanted to restore it, rename it the Jonah. You've had the blueprints on your desk for 3 years." Theodore froze, his breath shallow, as if she'd reached into his chest and pulled out a piece of his soul. He'd never told her about the name, the blueprints, the quiet vow he'd made to his grandfather's memory. A businessman rushed past, collar up against the rain, and the brief interruption broke the spell, but not the tension. Theodore straightened, his professional mask sliding back into place, though it felt flimsier now, like armor too thin to hold. "I should get home," he said, stepping out from under the umbrella, rain soaking his shoulders again. "You should," Layla replied, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a flicker of something. Hope, perhaps, or frustration. "Mrs. Ellis is probably waiting with dinner." She'd arranged for his housekeeper to prepare meals, noticing months ago that he'd been surviving on coffee and boardroom pastries. "Layla," Theodore said, hesitating, his voice almost lost in the rain. For a moment she thought he might say something real, something that would bridge the chasm between their roles and their hearts. Instead he nodded, a small, guarded gesture. "Thank you for staying late." She watched him walk away, his tall frame disappearing into the evening crowd, rain blurring him into a shadow. Only when he was gone did Layla realize her heart was racing, her umbrella trembling in her grip. She stood alone, the city humming around her, and wondered if he'd felt the same pull she had, the quiet, dangerous spark of something neither could yet name. The soft clink of crystal glasses and the murmur of Chicago's elite filled the air as Layla Nkosi sorted through Theodore Bennett's mail in the quiet hum of Pinnacle Hotel's 48th floor office. Her fingers paused on a heavy cream envelope, its gold lettering catching the morning light. An invitation to the Pinnacle Foundation Gala, a black tie affair where the city's power players mingled for charity and strategy. Layla's dark eyes scanned the details: silent auction, literacy programs, a room full of influencers who could sway Theodore's next acquisition. She adjusted her sleek braid, her silver bracelet glinting as she moved, and knocked twice on Theodore's frosted glass door. The faint tap of his Mont Blanc pen, slow today, thoughtful, greeted her before his voice did. "Come in," he called, his tone distracted, his green eyes fixed on a spreadsheet. Layla stepped inside, her heels silent on the carpet, the Chicago skyline a glittering backdrop beyond the windows. Theodore sat behind his oak desk, his tie already loosened, a rare sign of ease in the mid-morning lull. She held up the embossed invitation, her voice steady but pointed. "The Pinnacle Gala, RSVP for one or two?" Theodore barely glanced up, waving a hand as if dismissing a triviality. "Donate. I'm not going." Layla's lips pressed into a thin line, her patience fraying at the edges. "Theodore," she said, her tone firm, carrying the gentle insistence of someone who'd spent 5 years managing his blind spots. "3 competitors you're eyeing for acquisitions will be there: Sterling, Horizon, and Coastal Ventures." Her words landed like a challenge, her tablet glowing with notes on the guest list she'd already cross-referenced. Theodore leaned back, his chair creaking, his gaze finally meeting hers. Her dark eyes held a quiet fire, a reminder of her ability to see what he missed. Opportunities, risks, the pulse of the industry. "Then you go," he said, his voice casual but his eyes betraying a flicker of something deeper, something that made Layla's pulse quicken. "You're better at charming them than I am." The suggestion hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown, its weight settling in the space between them. Layla set the invitation on his desk, her fingers brushing the expensive paper, her expression unreadable. "You want me to represent Pinnacle Hotels alone?" she asked, her voice low, testing the edges of his intent. "Why not?" he replied, leaning forward, his elbows resting on the desk. "You represent me everywhere else." The words stung, sharp and unexpected, like a paper cut she didn't see coming. For 5 years, Layla had been his shadow, his strategist, the woman who anticipated his needs before he voiced them. But this felt like a dismissal, a relegation to a role that was safe, professional, invisible. She straightened, her posture impeccable, her dark hair pulled back in a sleek braid that framed her face like a crown. "Fine," she said, her voice clipped, professional, but laced with a defiance Theodore couldn't miss. "I'll go." Something flickered across his face, surprise perhaps, or regret, but it vanished before she could name it. "Good," he said, his tone too polished, too quick. "Take the company card for a dress, something—" He gestured vaguely, then stopped, as if realizing the trap he'd walked into. "Something professional, appropriate." The word landed like a stone, heavy with implications. Appropriate. For 5 years, Layla had been exactly that. Appropriate, indispensable, the perfect assistant who knew her place and never demanded more. She nodded, her smile tight. "Of course," she said, turning toward the door, her heels clicking faintly now, a rhythm of restraint. But as she left, the word echoed in her mind, a challenge she hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. Theodore watched her go, his fingers tightening around his pen, the slow tap resuming as if to steady his thoughts. He'd lied to himself, pretending this was about efficiency, about business. But the thought of Layla at the gala, commanding a room he'd chosen to avoid, stirred something he couldn't name. A mix of pride and unease that kept him staring at the closed door long after she'd gone. That evening, in a boutique on Michigan Avenue, Layla stood before a mirror, her reflection framed by soft lighting and racks of gowns. A conservative black dress hung on the rack, safe, forgettable, the kind of choice that screamed assistant at a corporate function. She reached for it, then stopped, her hand hovering as her sister Amara's voice crackled through her phone. "Don't tell me you're buying something boring, Lai," Amara said without preamble, her tone teasing but sharp. Layla sank onto the fitting room bench, suddenly exhausted. "He wants me to go to the gala alone, to represent the company," she said, her voice low. "I'm the appropriate choice. Professional, safe." The words tasted bitter, like coffee left too long on the burner. Amara's laugh was soft but knowing. "When did you become so safe, sis? You've been playing it safe for 5 years, managing his life while he barely sees yours?" Layla closed her eyes, the weight of Amara's words settling over her. Was she tired of it? Tired of being the woman who knew Theodore's every quirk, his coffee temperature, his hatred of tomatoes, the way he touched his grandfather's photo before a big decision, while he knew so little of her heart? "There's this other dress," she said suddenly, her eyes drifting to a sapphire gown on the rack, its silk shimmering like liquid starlight. "Show me," Amara demanded. Layla sent a photo, the gown's deep blue making her brown skin glow, her eyes bright with a fire she'd almost forgotten. "Buy it," Amara said instantly. "It's not appropriate," Layla protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Maybe tonight isn't about being appropriate," Amara countered. "Maybe it's about being seen." Layla stood, her reflection in the mirror no longer just an assistant, but a woman who could command a room. She bought the sapphire dress, its fabric cool against her fingers, a quiet rebellion against the boundaries she'd lived within for too long. Back in her Hyde Park apartment, she hung the gown on her closet door, where it gleamed like a question she wasn't sure she was ready to answer. Across the city in his penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, Theodore sat with his own gala invitation, his scotch untouched on the table. He'd lied to Layla, of course. He was going. He always did. But the thought of watching her navigate the gala, brilliant and untouchable, felt like a risk he hadn't calculated. He picked up his phone, then set it down, the weight of her absence in his empty apartment heavier than he'd ever admit. The Grand Palmer House ballroom glittered like a jewel box, its crystal chandeliers casting prisms across the polished marble floor, where Chicago's elite swirled in a choreographed dance of power and charm. Layla Nkosi stood near the silent auction tables, her sapphire gown catching the light with every subtle movement, the silk hugging her curves like a second skin. For the first time in 5 years, she wasn't Theodore Bennett's shadow, but a force in her own right, introducing herself as Pinnacle Hotel's representative, with a confidence that turned heads. Her sleek braid had been unpinned, her dark hair falling in soft waves over one shoulder, and her brown eyes sparkled with a quiet fire that drew curious glances from tech moguls and real estate titans alike. The air buzzed with jazz from a live ensemble, the saxophone's sultry notes weaving through the hum of conversation. But Layla's focus was singular: work the room, secure allies, prove she was more than an assistant. "Ms. Nkosi, your Vancouver project is the talk of the industry," a warm voice interrupted, smooth as the champagne in her hand. She turned to find Julian Carter, a developer from Coastal Ventures, his hazel eyes bright with genuine interest, his sandy hair catching the chandelier's glow. In his early 30s, he carried the easy confidence of success earned, not inherited, his tailored tuxedo accentuating a lean frame. Layla recognized his name. His firm's Portland renovation had made waves, and smiled, her professional mask softening. "Mr. Carter, I've followed your work," she said, her voice warm but measured. "The Portland project was bold." His grin widened, disarming. "Coming from Pinnacle, that's high praise. I was hoping to catch Theodore tonight, but I hear he's tied up." Layla's smile didn't falter, the lie she'd perfected sliding effortlessly into place. "Business emergency, I'm afraid." Julian's eyes lingered on her, appraising. "His loss. Care for champagne? I'd love to hear about your expansion plans." They moved toward the bar, their conversation flowing with an ease Layla hadn't felt in years. Julian was sharp, his questions probing, but respectful, his laughter genuine when she recounted a negotiation mishap in Dubai. For the first time in too long, she felt seen, not as Theodore's gatekeeper, but as a woman with ideas, ambition, a presence that commanded attention. Her laugh, rare, unguarded, like sunlight breaking through clouds, rang clear as Julian leaned closer, his hand brushing hers as he passed her a flute of champagne. The touch was fleeting, innocent, but it stirred a warmth she'd buried beneath years of professional restraint, a reminder of what it felt like to be pursued. Across the ballroom, partially obscured by a velvet-draped column, Theodore Bennett watched, his jaw tight, his scotch glass cold against his palm. He'd arrived unannounced, telling himself it was for last-minute networking, but his eyes had found Layla within moments, and the sight of her had stolen his breath. The sapphire gown transformed her, its deep hue making her brown skin luminous, her every gesture radiating a confidence that made the room feel smaller, as if she were its center. He'd lied about staying away, unable to resist the pull of seeing her in this world, where she shone brighter than anyone he'd ever known. But now, watching her laugh with Julian Carter, her head tilting back in that rare, unguarded way, a sharp ache twisted in his chest. Jealousy, raw and unfamiliar, clawing at the edges of his control. "Theodore Bennett, I thought you were skipping this one," a voice purred beside him, laced with knowing amusement. Evelyn Harper, the gala's silver-haired hostess, settled next to him, her black gown shimmering, her eyes sharp with the wisdom of someone who'd seen every human folly play out in rooms like these. "Careful, Theodore," she said, her tone biting but playful, gesturing toward Layla with her champagne flute. "She'll slip through your fingers while you're brooding over your drink." Theodore's grip tightened, the ice clinking in his glass. "You've misunderstood, Evelyn," he said, his voice low, but it lacked conviction, and her smile widened, unfooled. "I've been married 40 years, she countered, her voice softening. "I know a man who's found his heart but won't claim it. That girl's a star, and someone else is noticing." Theodore's gaze snapped back to Layla, where Julian was now saying something that made her smile, her eyes bright with amusement. The jazz ensemble shifted to a slow, sultry number, and Julian extended his hand, leading her toward the dance floor. Theodore's heart lurched as Layla accepted, her sapphire dress swaying as she moved, her hand resting lightly in Julian's. They danced with effortless grace, her laughter weaving through the music, a sound Theodore had only ever heard in stolen moments. Late nights in the office, quiet triumphs over a shared problem. Now it belonged to someone else, and the realization hit like a physical blow. Evelyn's words echoed, sharp and unyielding, and his control frayed, thread by thread. He set his glass down, the clink lost in the music's swell, and moved through the crowd, his strides long and purposeful, his green eyes locked on Layla. The room seemed to blur, the faces and voices fading into a dull roar as he closed the distance. Julian spun Layla gently, her dress flaring, and she laughed again, the sound piercing Theodore's chest. He reached them just as the song slowed, his voice rougher than he intended. "May I?" he asked, his eyes meeting Layla's, a silent plea beneath the command. Julian's eyebrows rose, but he stepped back with a gracious nod. "Of course," he said, his gaze flickering between them, sensing the undercurrent. "Ms. Nkosi, I'll find you later." Layla hesitated, her breath catching as she turned to Theodore, her dark eyes searching his face. Surprise flickered there, then confusion, then something deeper, hope perhaps, or recognition. She placed her hand in his, her fingers warm against his palm, and they stepped into the dance, the world narrowing to the space between them. The music wrapped around them, slow and intimate, and their bodies moved in perfect sync, as if they'd been dancing this way for years, circling each other in boardrooms and late-night strategy sessions. Theodore's hand rested on her waist, the silk of her gown warm beneath his touch, and he felt her pulse quicken, mirroring his own. "You lied about not coming," she whispered, her voice low, her breath grazing his ear. "I lied about everything," he admitted, his voice raw, his eyes locked on hers. The confession hung between them, heavy with the weight of 5 years, unspoken glances, careful distances, feelings buried beneath the veneer of professionalism. Layla's lips parted, but she didn't pull away, her hand tightening in his as they swayed, the ballroom fading into a haze of light and sound. Theodore's chest ached with the need to say more, to bridge the chasm he'd built. But the music held them captive, their dance a fragile bridge across years of restraint. For now it was enough, her warmth, her presence, the spark that ignited where their hands met, a promise of something neither could yet name. The Chicago night pressed against the windows of Layla and Kosi's Hyde Park apartment, its soft lights casting a warm glow over the cluttered charm of her living space. Books spilled from shelves, their spines worn from late-night reading, poetry by Audre Lorde, novels by Toni Morrison, stacked beside a half-finished crossword puzzle on the coffee table. A mug with tea stains sat next to a cozy throw draped over a worn sofa, the room a testament to a life fully lived, not just managed. Layla kicked off her heels, the sapphire gown from the Pinnacle Foundation Gala still clinging to her curves, its silk whispering as she moved. Her dark hair, freed from its braid, fell in loose waves, and her silver bracelet glinted as she set her clutch down, her hands trembling slightly. Theodore Bennett stood in her doorway, his tuxedo jacket unbuttoned, his green eyes intense yet hesitant, as if he'd stepped into a world he hadn't earned the right to enter. The drive from the gala had been impulsive, Theodore insisting on seeing her home, the silence in his sleek black car charged with the memory of their dance, his hand on her waist, her breath against his ear, his confession that he'd lied about everything. Now in her apartment, the air crackled with the weight of 5 years of restraint, their professional boundaries fraying like a thread pulled too tight. "Would you like something to drink?" Layla asked, moving toward the small kitchen, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. "Chamomile tea, fair warning. It's the opposite of your coffee. Might put you to sleep." Her teasing tone was a lifeline, a way to navigate the uncharted territory they'd stumbled into. Theodore's lips twitched, a rare, almost smile. "Whatever you're having," he said, his voice low, his eyes tracking her every move. Layla filled the kettle, her movements precise but deliberate, as if each action could delay the inevitable. Theodore stood in the living room, his tall frame filling the space, his gaze lingering on the details of her world, the poetry books, the puzzle, the small framed photo of her with her sister Amara laughing at a beach. This was Layla, not the polished assistant who managed his empire, but the woman who lived, dreamed, felt. The realization hit him like a quiet shock, stirring a longing he'd buried beneath boardroom bravado. "I wasn't expecting company," Layla said, glancing over her shoulder, her tone light but her eyes wary. "It's perfect," Theodore replied, and he meant it, the warmth of her space a stark contrast to the sterile precision of his penthouse. The kettle's soft whistle broke the silence, and Layla poured the tea, the chamomile's floral scent curling through the air. She handed him a mug, their fingers brushing, the contact sending a jolt through her. Theodore's hand steadied, but his eyes betrayed a storm, vulnerability, desire, fear. "Layla," he said, her name heavy on his tongue, "I've loved you for years." The words landed like a thunderclap, raw and unguarded, stripping away the careful distance they'd maintained. Layla's breath caught, her mug trembling in her hands as she set it down, her dark eyes wide with shock and something softer, something that made her heart race. "You saw me every day," she said, her voice low, steady but edged with pain, and said nothing. Theodore stepped closer, the space between them shrinking, his tuxedo jacket brushing against the kitchen counter. "I was scared," he admitted, his voice rough, his green eyes searching hers. "Scared of losing you, of ruining what we have. Watching you with Carter tonight." He trailed off, his jaw tightening at the memory of Julian Carter's hand on her waist, her laugh ringing across the ballroom. It felt like dying a little. Layla's lips parted, her professional mask crumbling, revealing the woman who'd spent years loving a man who saw her as indispensable but untouchable. "What we have," she said, her voice rising slightly, "is half a life, Theodore. I know your coffee order, your grandfather's stories, the way you loosen your tie when you're stuck. But do you know me?" The question hung in the air, a challenge that cut through 5 years of silences. Theodore's hand reached for hers, his fingers warm, steady, as if anchoring himself to her truth. I know you read poetry when the office is quiet, he said softly. I know you teach kids to read on weekends, that your laugh can change a room. I know you stayed with me when you could have left for any job in the city. His thumb traced the silver bracelet on her wrist, a gesture so intimate it stole her breath. But I don't know enough, Layla. I want to know everything. Layla's eyes glistened, her heart hammering as she stepped closer, the chamomile steam rising between them like a fragile veil. Then why now? She whispered, her voice trembling with hope and fear. Because I can't pretend anymore, Theodore said, his voice breaking, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing her skin. I can't watch another man see what I've been too afraid to claim. The words dissolved the last of their restraint, and Layla rose on her toes, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was tentative at first, a question. But when Theodore's arms wrapped around her, pulling her close, the kiss deepened, fierce and hungry, 5 years of longing pouring into the heat of their embrace. They broke apart, breathless, their foreheads resting together, the world outside her apartment fading into irrelevance. The kettle's steam had dissipated, the tea forgotten, but the air was thick with the promise of something new, something terrifying. This changes everything, Theodore murmured, his voice raw, his hand still cradling her face. Good, Layla whispered back, her eyes locked on his, her silver bracelet glinting in the soft light. Everything needed changing. They didn't move, didn't speak, the silence filled with the rhythm of their breathing, the quiet joy of finally touching the person who'd become essential to their existence. In that small kitchen, lit by a single lamp, Layla and Theodore stood on the edge of a precipice, knowing they'd crossed a line they could never uncross, and for the first time, neither wanted to. The morning light filtered through the blinds of Pinnacle Hotel's 48th floor office, casting long shadows across the polished oak desk where Theodore Bennett sat, buried in a stack of contracts that blurred before his eyes. Layla Nkosi arrived at her usual time, her tailored suit a shield against the surreal weight of the night before, her dark hair pulled back in a sleek braid that hid the loose waves he'd tangled his fingers in hours ago. She set his coffee down, black, extra shot, precisely 140 degrees. Her hands steady despite the tremor in her chest, the memory of his lips on hers still warm like an ember. Theodore glanced up, his green eyes meeting hers for a fraction of a second before darting away. The air between them thick with unspoken confessions. The office hummed with its usual rhythm, phones ringing, keyboards clacking. But today, every sound felt amplified, every glance loaded with the echo of their kiss. Layla moved to her desk, her tablet glowing with the day's schedule. But her mind replayed the gala's dance, the drive home, the chamomile tea forgotten in her kitchen as Theodore's arms pulled her close. She typed notes for the Miami investors' call, her fingers flying across the keys, but her focus fractured when Theodore's voice crackled through the intercom. Layla, the Vancouver file, he said, his tone clipped, professional, as if nothing had shifted in the space between them. She gathered the documents, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she entered his office, the door closing behind her with a soft click that felt like a barrier erected too late. Theodore avoided her eyes, his tie perfectly knotted, his posture rigid as he accepted the file, their fingers brushing in a spark that made him falter, his breath hitching almost imperceptibly. The morning conference call with the Phoenix group dragged on, Theodore's voice steady as he negotiated terms, but Layla, taking notes from the corner, caught the subtle tells, the way his hand loosened his tie, the slight pause before responses, signs of distraction she knew better than anyone. She interjected once, her voice calm, clarifying a clause on the Dubai expansion, and Theodore's gaze flicked to her, gratitude mixed with something deeper, a longing that made the room feel smaller. The call ended and silence settled, broken only by the distant hum of the city below. Layla stood to leave, but Theodore's voice stopped her. The Portland revisions, he said, his words a pretext, his eyes finally meeting hers, raw and searching. She handed him the tablet, their proximity electric, the memory of his confession. I've loved you for years. Hanging between them like a fragile thread, lunch arrived in a boardroom filled with investors, the table laden with catered sandwiches and salads. But Theodore barely touched his mind elsewhere as Layla sat across from him, her presence a constant pull. She performed their usual dance, passing documents, whispering insights. But today every gesture felt intimate, loaded. The way her hand brushed his when handing a pen, the subtle smile she offered when he closed a point. The investors droned on about occupancy rates and market trends, but Theodore's focus wavered, his eyes tracing the silver bracelet on her wrist, the one he'd touched last night as they talked until dawn. Layla felt it too, her notes blurring as she stole glances at him, his profile sharp in the fluorescent light, his vulnerability from the apartment still etched in her mind. By 3:00 p.m., the tension had built to a breaking point, the office emptying as staff filtered out for breaks, leaving the floor quiet save for the soft whir of printers. Layla stood in Theodore's doorway, her posture straight, her voice steady. "Theodore, about the Ellison project," she said, the words code for the truth they couldn't voice aloud, the loss that had left him in the rain, the confession that had shattered their boundaries. Theodore looked up, understanding flashing in his eyes, and gestured for her to close the door. The click echoed, sealing them in the glass-walled space where 5 years of careful distance had unraveled overnight. "This is impossible," he said without preamble, standing and moving to the window, his back to her as he stared at the Chicago skyline, the lake a distant shimmer. Layla stepped closer, her heart pounding. "Which part?" she asked, her voice low, challenging. "Working together or pretending nothing happened?" Theodore turned, his green eyes stormy, his tie now fully loosened. "Both," he admitted, running a hand through his hair, destroying the perfect styling. "I can't concentrate. I keep thinking about last night. Your apartment, the way you looked at me when I said I loved you." The words hung raw, vulnerable, and Layla's breath caught, her own fears rising. "I keep thinking about the way you said it," she countered, her voice steady but her hands clenching at her sides. "Like it was something you'd carried for too long. I'm afraid you'll decide this is too complicated and retreat back into being Mr. Bennett." Theodore's expression softened, pain etching his features as he closed the distance, stopping just short of touching her. "I'm afraid of that too," he said quietly. "Afraid that last night was a mistake, that you'll realize you can't respect a boss who crossed the line." His voice cracked, the CEO facade crumbling to reveal the man who'd stood in the rain, lost and human. Layla's eyes searched his, her resolve hardening. "What I'm afraid of," she said, stepping forward until their breaths mingled, "is that you'll choose safety over truth. Policies over us." Before he could respond, his intercom buzzed, his assistant's voice intruding. "Mr. Bennett, the Vancouver investors on line 1. Theodore glanced at the phone, then back at Layla, his eyes locked on hers as he weighed duty against desire. His hand hovered over the receiver, the ring insistent, a reminder of the empire he'd built. Then with a deliberate motion, he silenced it, the first time in 5 years he'd chosen anything over business. "Take a message," he said into the intercom, his voice firm, his gaze never leaving Layla's. "Tell them I'll call back." The line went dead, the silence profound, and Layla's heart soared, a smile breaking through her tension. Theodore stepped closer, his hand reaching for hers. "Lincoln Park, 5 Sui," he said, his voice a promise. "We'll figure this out. Us, the future, everything." Layla nodded, her fingers intertwining with his for a brief, electric moment before she pulled away. The office walls feeling too close, too public. She left his office, her steps lighter, the day's surreal haze lifting as anticipation built. Theodore watched her go, his phone silent now, the choice he'd made echoing in his chest. A shift in priorities that felt like the first step towards something real, something worth the risk. The late afternoon sun slanted through the leaves of Lincoln Park, casting dappled shadows on the weathered wooden bench by the pond where Layla Nkosi sat, her hands folded in her lap, her tailored suit a contrast to the casual joggers and dog walkers weaving through the paths. The air carried the faint scent of blooming flowers and fresh-cut grass, the pond's surface rippling gently with the breeze, ducks gliding across it in lazy circles. Layla's dark eyes scanned the horizon, her sleek braids swaying slightly as she shifted, her mind a whirlwind of the office's tension, the stolen glances, the silenced phone, Theodore's promise to meet her here at 5 WAM. Her silver bracelet caught the light, a small anchor amid the uncertainty, her heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear, wondering if he'd choose them over the empire that defined him. Theodore Bennett arrived exactly on time, his charcoal suit rumpled, his tie loose around his neck, his dark hair slightly disheveled as if he'd run his hands through it a dozen times. He spotted her immediately, his green eyes locking on hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. He settled beside her on the bench, close enough that their shoulders brushed, the warmth of his presence cutting through the cool evening air. "You came," he said, his voice low, laced with relief and a hint of surprise, as if he'd half expected her to vanish like a dream. Layla turned to him, her dark eyes steady, a small smile playing on her lips. "Did you think I wouldn't?" she asked, her tone light but probing. Theodore stared out at the pond, where a family of ducks quacked softly, the water reflecting the fading sun. "I thought you might have had time to think better of this. Of us," he admitted, his words heavy, vulnerable. "I thought you might realize that your boss falling in love with you is more complication than an opportunity." Layla studied his profile, the strong jaw, the faint lines around his eyes from years of late nights and high-stakes decisions, the way he held himself with a control that now seemed fragile, cracking at the edges. "Is that what you've realized?" she asked, her voice soft but insistent, drawing his gaze back to her. Theodore shook his head, his expression pained. "I've realized that I don't know how to separate Theodore from Mr. Bennett when it comes to you," he said, his voice quiet, thoughtful, as if each word was pulled from deep within. "I've realized that for 5 years, you've seen me more clearly than I see myself, and that terrifies me." A jogger passed, earbuds in, oblivious to the conversation unfolding like a storm about to break, and Layla reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his, the touch grounding them both. "What terrifies you about it?" she pressed, her thumb tracing circles on his palm, her dark eyes searching his, willing him to bear the truth. Theodore was silent for a long moment, the pond's ripples mirroring the turmoil in his chest, the distant laughter of children feeding the ducks a stark contrast to the weight between them. When he spoke, his words came slowly, each one a confession. "You know me, Layla. Really know me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You know I eat the same breakfast every morning because change makes me anxious. You know I work late because my empty apartment feels like failure. You know I'm better at reading quarterly reports than reading people." He turned to her fully, his green eyes raw, exposed. "What if knowing me that well means you know I'm not worth the risk?" The vulnerability in his voice broke something open in Layla's chest, a flood of emotion she'd held back for years. This wasn't the confident CEO who commanded boardrooms. This was the man who'd stood in the rain, lost in his grandfather's legacy. The man who'd confessed his love in her kitchen lamplight. She squeezed his hand, her voice steady, warm. "Do you want to know what I know about you?" she asked, and he nodded, fear flickering in his eyes. "I know you remember every employee's birthday and send flowers when their family members die, pretending it's just good business," she said, her tone gentle but firm. "I know you read every customer complaint personally and lose sleep over bad reviews. I know you donated anonymously to rebuild that Southside library after the fire last year." Theodore's grip tightened, his breath shallow as she continued, her words painting him not as the flawed man he saw, but as the one she loved. "I know you call your sister every Sunday, even when she's too busy to talk, because you promised your father you'd look after her," she said, her eyes glistening. "I know you keep a photo of your grandfather Jonah in your desk drawer and touch it before every major decision, drawing strength from his stories." Her voice softened, intimate. "I know you're not afraid of business risks. You're afraid of emotional ones because business failures you can fix, but heart failures feel permanent." Theodore brought their joined hands to his lips, pressing a soft kiss to her knuckles, the gesture tender, reverent. "You fell in love with me," he murmured, wonder in his voice, as if he couldn't quite believe it. Layla smiled, her heart swelling. I fell in love with you approximately 2 years, 3 months, and 12 days ago, she said, her voice light but laced with truth. During the Miami crisis, when you worked 36 hours straight to save those jobs, I brought you coffee at 3 a.m. and found you asleep at your desk with photos of the affected families on your screen. Theodore's eyes widened, touched by her precision, her memory of the exact moment. You remember the date? He asked, his voice hoarse. I remember the moment, she replied. You looked up at me with exhaustion in your eyes and said, how do I tell these people their livelihoods matter less than profit margins? And I realized you weren't just my boss. You were the man I wanted to spend my life protecting from a world that didn't deserve his heart. Theodore stood abruptly, pacing the small space in front of the bench, his hands raking through his hair as the sun dipped lower, painting the park in golden hues. This is insane, he said, his voice rising with the war inside him. We work together. I'm your boss. There are policies, procedures, and consequences. Layla remained seated, watching him struggle, her eyes calm amid his storm. There are also choices, she said softly. You can choose policies or you can choose me, but you can't choose both. Theodore stopped, turning to her, his expression torn, head versus heart, safety versus risk. It's not that simple, he protested. It's exactly that simple, she countered. It's also exactly that terrifying. His phone buzzed insistently in his pocket, an urgent text lighting up the screen. Tokyo investors threatening to pull out, need immediate response. Theodore pulled it out, staring at the message. The Empire calling him back as it always did. Layla watched, her breath held, knowing this was the moment, the choice that would define them. He looked at her, then at the phone, his thumb hovering over the screen. Then, with a deliberate motion, he turned it off, slipping it back into his pocket, the silence profound. What are you doing? Layla asked, her voice a whisper. Theodore stepped closer, cupping her face in his hands, his thumbs tracing her cheekbones. I'm choosing you, he said and kissed her fiercely, the world falling away as their lips met, rewriting every rule they'd ever known. The Jonah Hotel's grand opening bathed Chicago's skyline in a warm glow, its Art Deco facade restored to gleaming perfection, bronze letters spelling the Jonah, catching the late afternoon sun like a promise fulfilled. Inside the lobby, marble floors polished to a mirror shine reflected the crystal chandeliers overhead, their light dancing across vintage photographs lining the walls. Images of the hotel's storied past, including one of Jonah Bennett in his doorman uniform, standing proud beside the original front desk, his eyes twinkling with the quiet dignity of a man who'd welcomed dreams through those doors for nearly 2 decades. Layla Nkosi stood at the heart of it all, her tablet in hand as she oversaw the final preparations, her sapphire dress, reminiscent of that gala night, hugging her curves with elegant confidence. As COO of Pinnacle Hotels, she'd poured her vision into every detail. The restored concierge desk, the subtle nods to Jonah's era in the decor, the staff moving with purposeful grace, many of whom had been with the company for years, now infused with a pride that mirrored her own. The air hummed with anticipation, the faint scent of fresh flowers mingling with the polish of new beginnings, guests beginning to arrive, investors in tailored suits, city officials with polished smiles, journalists scribbling notes. Layla's dark eyes scanned the room, her sleek braids swaying as she directed a florist to adjust a bouquet, her silver bracelet glinting under the lights. This wasn't just a hotel, it was a legacy reborn, a testament to the man who'd inspired Theodore's empire, and to the partnership that had made it possible. Her heart swelled with a quiet triumph, the weight of 2 years' work, expansions, challenges, late nights debating designs, culminating in this moment. She touched the framed photo of Jonah behind the desk, a gesture echoing Theodore's habit, and felt a surge of emotion, knowing how far they'd come from careful office silences to this shared victory. Theodore Bennett appeared beside her, his presence as commanding as ever, his charcoal suit impeccable, but his green eyes softened with a vulnerability only she could see. The flowers arrived, he said, his voice low, intimate amid the growing buzz, his hand brushing hers in a touch that sent a familiar spark through her. Even after 2 years as equals in business and life, his nearness still made her pulse quicken, a reminder of the night he'd chosen her over everything safe. Layla smiled, straightening his tie with automatic affection, her fingers lingering. Perfect timing, she replied, checking her tablet one last time. The press will be here soon. Theodore's gaze lingered on her, pride and love mingling in his expression. He would have loved this, he murmured, his eyes drifting to Jonah's photo, the tension in his shoulders a subtle tell of the deeper meaning this held, the completion of a vow to honor his grandfather's stories, the dreams that walked through these doors. How do you always know exactly what I'm thinking? Theodore asked, his voice teasing, but warm, drawing her closer. Layla's laugh, rare and genuine, the sound that had first captured him, echoed softly. Practice, she said, her eyes twinkling. And because Jonah's photo is still in your desk drawer, and you touched it 3 times during this morning's budget meeting. Theodore caught her hands, stilling them against his chest, his touch tender. Some things don't change, he said, his voice dropping. The important things don't. Around them, the lobby filled with energy, staff finalizing setups, guests mingling, the hum of conversation rising like a symphony building to a crescendo. It was a different vibe from their corporate offices, warmer, more personal, a reflection of the dual leadership they'd forged through compromise and trust. A young woman with a press badge approached, her notebook ready, her eyes wide with curiosity. Ms. Nkosi, I'm Sarah Klein from the Chicago Business Journal, she said, extending a hand. Could I have a few minutes for the profile piece? Layla nodded, suppressing a smile. Even after 2 years as COO, after driving expansions that boosted profits by 40%, journalists still seemed surprised to find her at the helm. Of course, she replied, her voice clear and confident. Though this project has been a true collaboration, Mr. Bennett and I designed every aspect of the Jonah together. Sarah's gaze shifted between them, noting Theodore's protective stance. That's what I wanted to ask about, she said, her pen poised. Your professional partnership is rather unconventional. The dual leadership, shared decisions, and she hesitated, glancing at their intertwined hands. The rumored romantic relationship. Layla and Theodore exchanged a look, the kind of wordless communication honed over years. Boardrooms, breakfasts, late-night whispers. Not rumored, Layla said simply, her tone unflinching. We've been transparent about our relationship from the beginning. Theodore and I are business partners and life partners. Sarah scribbled furiously, her eyes lighting up. How do you make that work? The potential conflicts, the boundaries? Theodore stepped closer, his hand on Layla's back, a gesture of solidarity. The same way any successful partnership works, he replied, his voice steady. Mutual respect, clear communication, and knowing we're stronger together than apart. Layla laughed lightly, the sound warming the space. We argue like civilized adults and then compromise. Revolutionary, I know. Sarah nodded, impressed. And the success speaks for itself. 3 new markets since your promotion, Miss Nkosi. Layla corrected gently. Our expansion. Everything we've achieved has been collaborative. As the interview wrapped, Sarah moved to photograph the lobby, leaving Layla and Theodore alone amid the growing crowd. Theodore turned to her, his eyes searching hers. Do you remember? He asked, his voice low. When you asked why I was standing in the rain, pretending I'd forgotten my umbrella. Layla's smile deepened. I remember you hiding behind that lie while grieving Jonah's legacy. Theodore's hand tightened on hers. I never imagined we'd be here, building this together. The words carried the weight of their journey, from office restraint to this shared triumph, risks taken and rewards reaped. As guests filled the lobby, Theodore called for attention, his voice commanding the room. Thank you for celebrating Jonah, he said, the crowd quieting. This isn't just a hotel. It's a tribute to places that hold memories too precious to lose, to decisions made with heart over margins. Applause rippled, warm and genuine. But Theodore's eyes found Layla's. I want to introduce the person who made this possible, he continued, my partner in every sense. Layla Nkosi. She joined him, her heart pounding, not just from the achievement, but from the personal odyssey. The Jonah stands as proof, she said, her voice resonant, that the best partnerships honor vision and heart, creating spaces where dreams still walk through the doors. The applause swelled, thunderous, but Layla barely heard it, her gaze locked on Theodore's, seeing the vulnerable man beneath the CEO. As the crowd dispersed, he caught her hand. "Dance with me," he murmured, echoing their gala night. Layla stepped into his arms. No music needed, their rhythm perfected over years of circling each other. They swayed in the lobby, surrounded by celebration, her sapphire dress catching the light, his arms strong around her. "We were so careful once," Layla whispered. "Scared of the wrong things," Theodore replied, pulling her closer. "We built everything," she said, her voice soft. He kissed her forehead. "And we're just beginning." The Jonah hummed around them, a legacy alive. Their love the foundation that made it eternal. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey of hidden love and bold choices between Layla Nkosi and Theodore Bennett. A story about crossing professional boundaries for true connection. What do you think? Would you risk everything for a love like theirs, or play it safe? Share your thoughts in the comments below, like if it resonated with you, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of romance, ambition, and real-life drama. We appreciate your time and can't wait to see you in the next video.